Recently, after an evening's drinking, I returned home in search of something to kill. Whether that be in a physical or virtual capacity, your best bet usually sits on your hard drive. I don't know about you, but getting sufficiently sozzled tends to wake up the nostalgia gene we all have lodged in the back of our brain. This is usually stimulated by images or sounds from our childhood and adolescence. And just to give you a little jolt, and for me personally, it makes you feel a little bit warm inside, doesn't it? Anyway, this particular night, I was after some old school shooty action fun. And when I say old school, I don't just mean shite graphics. I'm a firm believer that graphics don't really matter to whether a game was fun or not. And when it comes to a game, that's really all that does matter. As an example, after 10 hours of playing Skyrim, the snowy western RPG setting had me reinstalling Icewind Dale, which I found myself a lot more immersed in. I realise that won't reflect anyone else's opinion, but just a rough idea of the kind of massive twat I am. Getting back on track, usually my need for shooting things in the face will draw me to Battlefield, and while that is probably the best simulated realistic combat experience around at the moment, I didn't want that. I wanted to be able to jump around the map firing rockets into the face of something not resembling the same old boring soldier. Which is when I remembered that I had downloaded, installed and forgotten about the Dark Places HD mod for the original Quake. I know I said I didn't care about graphics, but shut up. After roughly about 45 seconds of playing, I realised exactly what made early shooters so fantastically fun to play, and that is that they absolutely make no sense. You see that down there at the bottom? Don't be scared, that's a health percentage. You see that gun? It doesn't really exist. No one can really run this fast. No one constructs buildings this way. There is no real reason for anything to be anywhere, but that in itself is why everything fits. It's a realised world which makes everything instantly accessible. One thing that always irritates me about new shooters is the way they try to blend a bonkers premise in a realistic setting. If you want my soldier to be a believable human being that gets tired when he runs and can only carry 2 weapons at a time, don't make it so he has Wolverine rejuvenating powers. If you're going to include that mechanic, you might as well turn on no clip and have me flying around the map. Anyway, after playing through Quake in rather a quick succession, I instantly turned myself onto Quake 2, which if you have the Steam version, do make sure you download the KM Quake 2 pack, because not only does it add full support for high resolutions and enhanced graphics, it most importantly puts the music back in its rightful place. Playing through this game is even more of a blast than the original. The action is relentless. Once you start the game, you're running and gunning pretty much right to the end with almost no need to ever stop. There are short interludes of plot, but I can't say I ever sat through these. Where the original Quake aspired to be a dark, moody, horror-inflected shooter with music supplied by 9 Inch Nails, Quake 2 goes with a heavy metal approach, letting sonic mayhem set the tone for the entire game with a soundtrack that never gets old. After Quake 2, shooters progressively got more advanced with the introduction of Half-Life, which managed to marry together a fanciful sci-fi plot with realistic characters and settings, whilst keeping itself rooted in fun combat, something which has been accomplished very few times over the past few years. The Quake franchise skipped the whole plot idea completely with Quake 3, which was more of a competitor to the absolutely sublime Unreal Tournament games, but in 2005 they released a proper sequel to Quake 2, and a week ago I finished it again for the 100th billionth time. Quake 4 was released a year after the disappointingly received Doom 3, although I like Doom 3 a lot, and it uses the same Tech 4 engine. This time around there has been much more of a substantial effort for plot, although in true Quake fashion you could be forgiven for not following it, because at its core, like all its predecessors, this is a game that was built with fun and gameplay in mind. That isn't to say that the plot is throwaway. It does its job at progressing you through the story, and for the first time ever that I'm aware of, there are NPCs along the way to help you out. This time around you play as Matthew Kane, a Marine along with others who in the wake of the events of Quake 2 have been ordered to travel and secure the Strogg homeworld. And that is pretty much all you need to know. You're a human, and the Strogg are big cyborg bastards with varying degrees of size and weaponry who want to shoot you in the face before you blast them with an arsehole full of lightning. Thankfully, mechanics-wise, nothing has changed since the previous games. Although for now, your character is a bit slower and has a realistic weight to him, you can still carry all 10 weapons at once. If you're hurt, you have to find a med pack, or if you're lucky, your medic following you around didn't get a face full of rockets. You can still quick save, which if you're playing on hard mode, you'll be doing a lot. And most importantly, killing shit is fun. Target acquired. The plot will take you to various locations, all of which resemble a similar biomechanical industrial setting with varying degrees of shifts in mood. The best way to describe it is the first act resembles Quake 2, then it descends into a more darker setting of Quake 1, and finally ending with a mixture of the two. I realise that's a lazy way to describe the game, but that isn't really what the game is about. Where modern games will sit heavily on the progression of the journey of the main character and the surrounding plot, Quake 4's progression is much more weapons and enemy based, getting bigger and better as the game reaches its climax. Early on you will get the standard blaster, machine gun, shotgun, grenade launcher, followed by a surprising return of the nail gun from the original Quake and the brilliantly fun hyper blaster from Quake 2, and of course the much loved railgun. Obtaining new weapons and fighting new enemies is where the game claims its pacing, and it does it well enough that you never get bored of the combat from start to finish. You will have obtained half of the arsenal a few hours in, but over the course of the game, whether it be on the dropship between missions or from engineers you meet around the level, your weapons will gain upgrades, giving them a whole new lease of life. Some of the upgrades are more necessity than innovation. For example, the machine gun and shotgun both receive extended magazines, which, as enemies progressively get harder, becomes more useful. Whereas the nail gun's lock-on targeting system, which allows you to shoot round corners, and the hyper blaster's bouncing energy, help to reinvent the weapons you currently have in a much more fun way. I've spoken a lot about how the gameplay is the key to making the game enjoyable, but that isn't to say that the plot doesn't take some twists and turns. Roughly about a quarter of the way in, you encounter this big mother, who's massively overpowered and decides to take you captive. What you awake to is probably one of the most surprising moments I have had during a game. By this point, you know that the Strogg are using human body parts for their own devices, and looking down the conveyor belt gives you a rough idea of what's going to happen. Usually in games and films, something convenient will happen where the machine breaks down and you're able to break free, but my expectations were slashed the moment I got my legs sawn off. The convenient part does come moments after when you are saved before being brainwashed as a Strogg, but if the game had ended there, I wouldn't know whether to be impressed or annoyed. Just a few moments later and you're back in the action, only now you can run faster, you have more health, and you look absolutely badass.
You can't go running around unarmed. Grab Moore's weapons.
There is actually something I love about that plot twist, and I think it's that you wouldn't get it with any other game, and that's that it wasn't a big deal. The game almost begrudgingly lets it happen, but as soon as it does, it drags you back in saying, don't worry, that's out the way now, we've got things to shoot, get back in the action. From this point on, the pace of the game now picks up, introducing new enemies and harder versions of ones prior. The pace still is not as relentless as Quake 2, however this is partially due to poorly executed rail sections, and these really are the game's low points. Other than these sections, the game is pretty much exclusively an indoor affair, but these outside areas don't seem catered for by the game's engine. There are some attempts to make these outside areas more interesting by way of piloting a hovercraft and a huge mech, but I found these parts just to be internally boring. As the game enters its third act, you will encounter bigger enemies more frequently, and even a few boss battles along the way.
Hey! You have to get out of here! I don't know how much longer I can last!
If I had one gripe, which I do, is that the music in the game is really lacking. There is the odd track here and there, but nothing that matches the brewing despair of the original or the frantic energy of the number 2. But as a solution, you can always play the Quake 2 soundtrack alongside it, which I find works for virtually any game. Quake 4 is a hidden gem, and one you should definitely check out if you haven't already and are a fan of mindless shooters. It was nice to find out that all these games are still fun to play today, and it made me a little bit disappointed when I finished them all. It's left me with a real want for id Software games, which is what inspired me to start playing Rage again. Although I haven't played Doom 2 in a while.